That's a great question. With the exception of Serbia, the other five Central and Eastern European countries that were within our survey all, on average, had quite negative attitudes towards China, which made them quite similar to the Western and Northern European countries that were in the survey as well. However, kind of digging deeper, we found a couple of variables that really stood out as distinguishing the ways in which Central and Eastern Europeans view China. And not surprisingly, those have to do with the unique aspect of the experience of the Cold War and communism. Central and Eastern European countries were communist. They were part of the Eastern Bloc. They were under the thumb of the Soviet Union. And many of them, like Latvia and Poland in our survey, were right on the Russian border and have an even longer history of interaction with Russia. And so what we found is that self-identifying as belonging more to the East or West, and also attitudes towards communism as an ideology and one's own country's communist past, and also attitudes towards Russia, all played a big role in helping understand how Central and Eastern European publics felt about China. The Czech Republic was a really fascinating example for me, and in terms of looking at the data. And my colleague, Richard, who is an expert on Czech politics, also has done quite a bit of work on this. And it was extremely interesting to see how divided the Czech public is on a variety of issues, and including China. And so what we found very consistently in the data was that Czechs who support the opposition, are part of the opposition, who are more sort of self-identifying with the West or more pro-Western, tended to be more negative about the communist past, tended to feel more negatively about communism as a political system, tended to feel more negatively about Russia, and ultimately to feel more negatively about China. Whereas Czechs who were supporters of the current president sort of were the opposite. They ended up being more positive about communism, the communist past, and Russia, and therefore slightly more positive towards China. The Czech Republic was sort of one extreme in that China is so central to domestic political discourse that we found that all these variables I just mentioned were tied up with China attitudes. In some of the other countries that are geographically closer to Russia and have a longer history of interaction with Russia, the other variables didn't matter nearly as much. And they only did so, the East-West self-identification, the feelings about communism as a political system, the attitudes towards their country's communist pasts, only mattered insofar as they first shaped attitudes towards Russia. So any impact that those variables had on China attitudes was mediated through attitudes towards Russia. And essentially the metaphor I used, that we used in our paper, was to say that China was sort of blinded by the Russian sun. That Russia is such a big presence for, say, Latvians or Poles, that any sort of thinking about China is completely sort of seen through this looming presence of Russia. And I think it's very understandable when you learn the history of countries like Poland and all the Baltic states with such a large neighbor. They simply can't see the East except through Russia. And you literally see that in the survey data. It was fascinating. I think in terms of geopolitics going forward into the 21st century, one of the hot topics that alarmists like to focus on is the specter of another, it used to be called the Sino-Soviet alliance in the 50s during the Cold War. Now people worry about China and Russia forming a new alliance against the West. And of course, we do have the beginnings of a new ideological confrontation that some people are referring to as Cold War 2.0, as increasingly geopolitical competition in the 21st century is taking on ideological overtones. So it is true that we sort of have capitalism, liberalism on the one hand, and authoritarianism represented by countries like China, Russia, Turkey on the other hand. However, I think what our survey research shows is that there's a danger for China in cozying up to Russia, at least insofar as European public opinion goes. Because the closer that China associates itself with Russia, the more negatively progressive Central and Eastern Europeans, and certainly progressive Western Europeans, will feel about China. But then also, at least among those Eastern Europeans right on Russia's border, as we discussed earlier, the Poles, the Latvians, the Baltics, everyone needs to distinguish themselves from Russia. So, the closer that China grows to a kind of threatening Russia, I think in the eyes of Russia's immediate neighbors, that'll be a bad thing. So for those nationalists, for example, in Poland, I would imagine China growing closer to Russia will actually hurt China's image in those countries. So that's kind of the takeaway in terms of geopolitics, is that there is a downside for China in terms of growing close to Russia.